Sarah was 6 months pregnant and dreaming of a perfect life in her new neighborhood. Then she met Margaret, the cruel HOA president who hated young families. Margaret's harassment nearly killed Sarah's unborn baby. But Margaret had no idea that Sarah's father was the state's top prosecutor. Before watching full story, comment below from where you're watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. Sarah Martinez was 6 months pregnant when she and her husband David moved into Willowbrook Estates. They had saved for years to afford this beautiful neighborhood with its clean streets and pretty houses. Sarah's belly was round and she glowed with happiness about having their first baby. Everything seemed perfect until they met Margaret Thornfield. Margaret was 62 years old and had been the HOA president for 8 years. She had never been married or had children. The HOA was her whole life, and she treated every small rule like it was the most important thing in the world. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning. Sarah was watering her small herb garden when Margaret came to her fence with a clipboard. "Mrs. Martinez," Margaret's voice was cold and mean. "I need to talk to you about violations." Sarah looked up, confused. "Violations? What do you mean?" Margaret looked at her papers. "First, your garden gnome is not allowed. Second, your mailbox number is painted in the wrong color of black. Third, your husband's car was parked too far out in the driveway yesterday." Sarah felt her baby kick as she got stressed. "I'm sorry, I didn't know about these rules. Can you show me?" "Not knowing is not an excuse," Margaret cut her off. "You signed the HOA papers. You have 2 days to fix these problems or you will pay fines." Margaret walked away with a mean smile. This wasn't about rules, this was about power. Over the next few weeks, Margaret came to their house every day with new complaints. The grass was too long. The welcome mat was not straight. Sarah's car was parked wrong. Each violation cost them $100. David tried to talk to Margaret, but she wouldn't listen. "Rules are rules, Mr. Martinez. If you can't afford to live in a nice neighborhood, maybe you should move somewhere cheaper." Sarah's pregnancy was getting harder. The stress was making her blood pressure go up, and her doctor was worried. But Margaret didn't care. She seemed happy when she saw Sarah was upset. The worst day came on a rainy Thursday night. Sarah was bringing groceries inside when she slipped on the wet steps. She caught herself, but it scared her and she felt pain. David rushed her to the hospital, and the doctor said Sarah was having early labor pains. "You need complete bed rest," Dr. Williams said seriously. "Any stress could be dangerous for you and your baby." The next morning, while Sarah was stuck in bed, Margaret came to their door with the biggest fine yet. "Your newspaper was on the walkway for more than 4 hours, Margaret told David. "That's a $500 fine for keeping the property messy." "My wife is on bed rest," David begged. "She almost lost our baby yesterday. Please show some kindness." Margaret's eyes looked cruel. "Personal problems don't excuse breaking rules. Pay the fine or I'll take legal action. I won't let this neighborhood's reputation be ruined by people who can't keep basic standards." That night, Sarah cried while David held her. They had already paid over $2,000 in HOA fines, money they had saved for the baby's room. But worse than losing money was the constant fear and stress that was threatening their baby's life. Margaret's cruelty reached its peak on a quiet Sunday morning. Sarah was resting in bed when she heard shouting outside. Looking through the window, she saw Margaret watching 2 men cut down the small apple tree David had planted to celebrate their pregnancy. "Stop," Sarah called out, putting on a robe and rushing outside as fast as she could. "That's our tree." "Unauthorized landscaping," Margaret said with an evil smile. "The tree was planted without HOA permission. It's being removed and you're paying for it." "Please," Sarah begged with tears in her eyes. "My husband planted that tree for our baby. It's not hurting anyone." Margaret stepped closer and whispered viciously, "Listen here, you little girl. I run this neighborhood. You and your husband are nothing but trash who somehow got enough money to buy a house where you don't belong. Every time I see your pathetic face, every time I see you walking around with that bastard in your belly, it reminds me that our standards are getting lower." The cruel words hit Sarah like punches. She felt something wet between her legs and looked down to see blood. I think something's wrong," she whispered. Margaret looked at the blood and smiled meanly. "Looks like your problem might solve itself." Sarah collapsed on the ground. David arrived at the hospital to find Sarah in emergency surgery. The stress had caused serious problems that could kill both her and their baby. He sat in the waiting room for 6 terrible hours, praying and crying. Dr. Williams finally came out, tired but smiling. "They're both going to be okay, but it was very close. Sarah must stay on complete bed rest for the rest of her pregnancy. Any stress at all could be deadly." When David finally saw his wife, Sarah was pale and weak but alive. Their baby's heartbeat came through the monitor next to her bed. "What happened?" he asked gently. Through tears, Sarah told him about Margaret's final cruel words. David felt angrier than he had ever been in his life. "I'm calling the police," he said. "What's the point?" Sarah whispered. "She didn't actually threaten me. And even if they believe us, what can they really do? She's been careful to stay within the law." David knew she was right, but he couldn't let this happen. There had to be some way to stop Margaret. Then Sarah's father arrived. Robert Sterling had been in court when he got David's panicked phone call. As soon as he heard "hospital," he left his case and drove straight from the state capitol. Robert was a dignified man in his late 50s with silver hair and kind eyes that could turn to steel when facing injustice. He was also the Attorney General of the state. Robert held his daughter's hand as she told him about Margaret's months of harassment and the final, devastating encounter. With each word, his face got darker. He had spent his career protecting people from those who abused their power, and now someone had nearly killed his daughter and grandchild. "Dad, there's nothing we can really do," Sarah said weakly. She was careful. She never actually made threats. Robert smiled grimly. "Sweetheart, you'd be surprised what we can do when someone tries to harm my family. Margaret Thornfield has no idea who she's dealing with." That night, Robert made several phone calls. Within hours, a full investigation was started into Willowbrook Estates HOA and its president. What they found was far worse than anyone had imagined. Margaret Thornfield's HOA rule had been built on stealing money and abusing power. The investigation showed years of financial crimes that would send her to prison for a very long time. For 8 years, Margaret had been stealing from the HOA money. She had set up fake maintenance companies that only existed on paper, paying herself for work that was never done. She had increased real expenses and kept the extra money. She had charged residents for community improvements that never happened. The excessive fines she had given residents like Sarah and David weren't just harassment. They were part of a plan to steal money. Margaret had been using the HOA like her personal bank account, stealing over $400,000 from the community she claimed to protect. But the money crimes were just the beginning. The investigation also found a pattern of targeted harassment against residents Margaret didn't like. Young families, minorities, and anyone who challenged her were subjected to increasingly harsh enforcement of ridiculous rules. Several families had been forced to sell their homes and leave the neighborhood because of Margaret's persecution. Most damaging of all were the security camera recordings from the day Sarah collapsed. Margaret's cruel words about Sarah's pregnancy, her cold reaction to seeing the blood, and her obvious satisfaction at Sarah's medical emergency were all captured in clear video and audio. Margaret was in her kitchen, counting the latest fine money, when the FBI agents knocked on her door. She answered with her usual bossy attitude, thinking they were there about some small neighborhood complaint. "Mrs. Thornfield, you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy," Agent Morrison said as he showed his badge. Margaret's face went white. "There must be some mistake. I'm the HOA president. I have authority here." "Your authority just ended," Agent Morrison replied as he put handcuffs on her. As Margaret was led away, neighbors came out to watch. Many of them were victims of her harassment who had never dared to speak up. Now they watched with satisfaction as their tormentor was finally brought to justice. The local news cameras caught every moment of Margaret's walk of shame. The woman who had ruled through fear was reduced to tears as she realized her world was falling apart. The trial of Margaret Thornfield became big news. The prosecution, led personally by Attorney General Robert Sterling, showed the picture of a woman who had used her position to terrorize innocent families while stealing their money. Witness after witness took the stand to describe Margaret's abuse. David testified about the months of harassment, the ridiculous fines, and the toll it had taken on his pregnant wife. When he described finding Sarah collapsed and bleeding while Margaret watched with satisfaction, several jury members wiped away tears. But it was Sarah's testimony that sealed Margaret's fate. Despite being 8 months pregnant and still fragile from her ordeal, Sarah took the stand to face her tormentor. Her voice was quiet but strong as she described the fear, stress, and humiliation Margaret had put her family through. "She didn't just steal our money," Sarah said, her hand on her belly. "She tried to steal our joy, our peace, and nearly our child's life. All because she couldn't stand to see a young family happy in her neighborhood." Margaret's defense lawyer tried to portray her as a dedicated community leader who had made some small mistakes. But the evidence was overwhelming. The financial records, the video footage, and the testimony of dozens of victims painted a clear picture of systematic abuse and corruption. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. On the charge of embezzlement in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of fraud in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of racketeering, we find the defendant guilty. The verdicts continued, each one hitting Margaret like a physical blow. When the judge sentenced her to 10 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 5 years, Margaret finally broke down completely. "This isn't fair," she screamed as the officer approached with handcuffs. "I was protecting property values. I was maintaining standards. These people don't belong in our neighborhood." Even in defeat, Margaret couldn't understand that her real crime wasn't just the money theft. It was the theft of human dignity and peace. She had used her power not to serve her community, but to satisfy her own need for control and superiority. As Margaret was led away to begin her prison sentence, Sarah and David sat in the courtroom holding hands. Their baby was due in just a few weeks, and for the first time in months, they felt truly at peace. Baby Elena Sterling Martinez was born on a sunny Tuesday morning, exactly 2 weeks after Margaret's sentencing. She was healthy, beautiful, and loud, announcing her arrival to the world with strong lungs that suggested she would never be silenced by bullies. Sarah held her daughter in the same hospital where she had nearly lost her just months before. This time the tears were tears of joy. The Willowbrook Estates HOA was dissolved and reformed with new leadership focused on actually serving the community. The stolen money was recovered and used to improve the neighborhood's common areas and reduce fees for struggling families. The ridiculous rules Margaret had imposed were abolished, replaced with reasonable guidelines that respected residents' rights and dignity. David planted a new apple tree in their yard, this one even bigger than the first. No one complained about unauthorized landscaping. Sarah's herb garden flourished, and she added vegetables and flowers without fear of fines or harassment. Their garden gnome was joined by a small family of ceramic rabbits, and their mailbox was painted in whatever shade of black Sarah happened to like that week. But the most important change was the feeling in the neighborhood itself. Families who had lived in fear for years were finally free to enjoy their homes. Children played in yards without worrying about stepping on the wrong patch of grass. Neighbors talked to each other over fences instead of reporting each other for violations. In prison, Margaret struggled to adapt to her new reality. The woman who had demanded absolute obedience from others now faced guards and inmates who cared nothing for her former authority. She tried to establish herself as a leader among the prisoners, attempting to organize them and impose rules just as she had in Willowbrook Estates. It didn't go well. Within her first month, Margaret had been written up multiple times for trying to discipline other inmates and challenging the guards' authority. She couldn't understand why her natural leadership abilities weren't being recognized and respected. Meanwhile, the investigation into her crimes continued to expand. Other HOAs in the state were audited, revealing that Margaret's corruption wasn't unique. A wider pattern of abuse by power-hungry HOA officials was exposed, leading to new laws protecting homeowners from harassment and requiring greater oversight of community associations. Margaret became the face of HOA abuse, her story used as a warning in legal textbooks and training materials. The case of Thornfield versus Sterling became required reading for property management students, showing how the abuse of small authority could escalate into serious criminal behavior. As Elena grew from a baby into a toddler, the Martinez family flourished in their peaceful neighborhood. Sarah's design business took off as she gained clients throughout the region. David was promoted to assistant principal at his school. They never forgot the lesson of their ordeal with Margaret, that silence in the face of bullying only enables more abuse. Sarah began volunteering with a legal aid society that helped homeowners fight unjust HOA actions. She spoke at community meetings, sharing her story and encouraging others to stand up for their rights. The Margaret Thornfields of the world count on us being too afraid or too tired to fight back, Sarah would tell audiences. But when we stand together, when we refuse to be intimidated, bullies lose their power. David started a support group for families dealing with HOA harassment. Meeting in their living room every month, victims shared their stories and strategies for fighting back. Many of the attendees were former Willowbrook residents who had been driven away by Margaret's abuse, and they found healing in finally being able to tell their stories without fear. On a warm spring morning, 2-year-old Elena took her first steps in the backyard where her mother had once collapsed from stress and fear. She walked across the grass toward the apple tree her father had planted, her small hands reaching for the low-hanging branches. Sarah watched from the porch, amazed at how different this moment felt from those dark days when she had wondered if her daughter would even survive to be born. The yard was full of life now, flowers bloomed everywhere, vegetables grew in raised beds, and children's toys were scattered across the lawn without fear of HOA citations. "Look at her go," David said, wrapping his arms around his wife. "She's fearless." "She gets that from her grandfather," Sarah laughed, thinking of Robert Sterling's determination to see justice done. Elena reached the apple tree and patted its trunk with both hands, babbling happily. The tree had grown tall and strong, its branches heavy with fruit. It stood as a symbol of their family's strength and their right to plant roots wherever they chose to call home. 3 years into her sentence, Margaret sat in her prison cell reading a magazine article about the Homeowner Protection Act. The article detailed how her case had led to sweeping reforms that had helped thousands of families avoid the kind of harassment she had inflicted on the Martinez family and others. For the first time since her arrest, Margaret began to understand the true scope of what she had done. The magazine included quotes from Sarah Martinez, who had become a prominent advocate for homeowner rights. Sarah spoke about the lasting trauma of constant harassment, the medical complications that had nearly cost Elena's life, and the financial hardship that had delayed their dreams of starting a family. Margaret had always justified her actions as necessary for maintaining neighborhood standards. She had convinced herself that she was protecting property values and community quality. But reading Sarah's words, seeing the long-term damage her behavior had caused, Margaret finally began to grasp that she hadn't been protecting anything, she had been destroying lives. The letter she wrote to Sarah that night was her first step toward accepting responsibility for her actions. It was a difficult letter to write, acknowledging the pain she had caused and expressing genuine remorse for her behavior. She didn't expect forgiveness, didn't ask for it, but she felt compelled to finally tell the truth about her motivations and her regrets. Sarah stared at Margaret's letter for a long time before showing it to David. The woman who had terrorized them, who had nearly cost them their daughter's life, was asking for nothing but offering what seemed to be genuine remorse. "What do you think?" David asked after reading the handwritten pages. "I think she's finally starting to understand what she did," Sarah replied. "But understanding and making amends are different things." They discussed it for weeks, weighing their feelings and considering what response, if any, would be appropriate. Elena played around their feet as they talked, a constant reminder of what they had almost lost to Margaret's cruelty. In the end, Sarah decided to write back. Not to offer forgiveness, which would take much more time and soul-searching, but to acknowledge Margaret's letter and explain the ongoing impact of her actions. "Your harassment didn't end when you were arrested," Sarah wrote. "I still sometimes wake up anxious about things that shouldn't matter. Whether our grass is the right length, whether our decorations are properly placed. Elena will grow up hearing the story of how someone tried to harm her before she was even born, simply because they didn't think our family belonged in their neighborhood. These scars don't disappear just because you've acknowledged causing them." But Sarah also acknowledged Margaret's apparent remorse. "However, I'm glad you're finally beginning to understand the real impact of your actions. True accountability means accepting that some harm can't be undone, even as we work to prevent similar harm in the future." The annual Willowbrook Estates community picnic looked nothing like the strict, rule-bound gatherings of Margaret's era. Children ran freely across the common areas, their laughter echoing off houses painted in many different approved colors. Parents chatted over barbecue grills while teens played frisbee on grass that was allowed to be whatever length seemed natural. Sarah served on the new HOA board, which met monthly in residents' homes rather than the formal conference room Margaret had preferred. Their meetings focused on actual community needs, organizing block parties, coordinating snow removal, and maintaining the playground equipment, rather than measuring grass length and counting garden gnomes. "It's amazing what this place could be when people aren't afraid of their own neighbors," said Mrs. Chin, an elderly resident who had been one of Margaret's frequent targets. "I can finally enjoy my garden without worrying about someone measuring my rose bushes." Elena, now 4 years old, ran up to her mother with a fistful of dandelions picked from the common area. In Margaret's time, such weeds would have been cause for community-wide violation notices. Now they were simply flowers in a little girl's hand. 6 years into her sentence, Margaret Thornfield was a different person than the woman who had been led away in handcuffs. Prison had stripped away her pretensions and forced her to confront the reality of her actions without the justifications she had built up over years of unchecked authority. She had started tutoring other inmates for their high school equivalency exams, using her education and organizational skills to help rather than harm for the first time in years. The work was humbling. Many of her students had overcome challenges that made anything Margaret had ever faced look small, yet they approached their studies with determination and grace that put her former petty tyrannies to shame. "Why do you help us?" one student asked during a break from their math lesson. Margaret considered the question carefully. Because I spent years tearing people down when I should have been building them up. I can't undo the harm I caused, but maybe I can prevent some future harm by helping people like you succeed. She had also become an advocate for prison education programs, writing letters to state legislators about the importance of giving inmates opportunities to better themselves. Her correspondence with Sarah had evolved into a respectful dialogue about justice, redemption, and the long process of making amends for serious wrongs. Elena Martinez was 7 years old when she first asked her parents about the woman who had been mean to them before she was born. Sarah and David had always been honest with their daughter, but they had waited until she was old enough to understand the concepts of fairness, bullying, and standing up for what's right. There was a lady who didn't think we belonged in our neighborhood, Sarah explained as they sat in Elena's bedroom. She was unkind to us and to other families, and she made rules that weren't fair. What happened to her? Elena asked. Grandpa Robert helped make sure she had to follow the same rules as everyone else, David said. She went to prison because she broke important laws about being honest and treating people fairly. Elena thought about this for a moment. Do you think she learned her lesson? Sarah and David exchanged glances. They had been corresponding with Margaret for 2 years now, and while they weren't ready to offer full forgiveness, they had seen genuine signs of change and remorse. We think she's trying to learn, Sarah said carefully. Sometimes people have to face consequences for their actions before they can understand how much they've hurt others. The important thing is that we stood up for ourselves and for other families who were being treated unfairly. Elena nodded solemnly. Like when I tell the teacher if someone is being mean to kids on the playground. Exactly like that, David said, pulling his daughter into a hug. Standing up to bullies isn't always easy, but it's always important. As Margaret's release date approached, she faced the daunting prospect of rebuilding her life. She had lost her house to legal fees and restitution payments. Her few family members had cut off contact years ago. She had no job prospects and limited savings. But she also had something she hadn't possessed when she entered prison: genuine remorse and a commitment to making whatever amends were possible. Through her correspondence with Sarah, Margaret had learned about the Legal Aid Society where Sarah volunteered. After much soul-searching, Margaret wrote to the organization's director, offering to share her expertise about HOA operations, not as someone seeking redemption, but as someone with unique insights into how community associations could be manipulated and corrupted. The offer was met with skepticism, understandably. Why would victims of HOA abuse want help from someone who had been one of the worst abusers? But after extensive discussions and consultations with Sarah and other advocates, the organization decided to accept Margaret's offer on a probationary basis. Margaret would work with their legal team to identify warning signs of HOA corruption and abuse, helping them develop better strategies for protecting homeowners' rights. She would receive no compensation beyond basic living expenses, and her involvement would be closely monitored. Margaret's new life was quiet and purposeful. She lived in a small apartment, worked with legal aid organizations, and slowly built relationships with people who knew her as someone trying to make amends rather than someone who had once wielded power cruelly. Her work with homeowners' rights organizations was making a real difference. She had helped identify corrupt HOA practices in dozens of communities, leading to investigations that protected thousands of families from the kind of abuse she had once inflicted. The irony wasn't lost on her. The expertise she had developed as an abuser was now being used to protect potential victims. It was fitting justice, and she embraced the role wholeheartedly. 5 years after her release, Margaret received an unexpected invitation. Elena Martinez, now 15, had written a school paper about justice and redemption, using Margaret's case as a central example. She had been invited to present her paper at a statewide student conference on criminal justice, and she wanted Margaret to attend. I want people to see that justice isn't just about punishment, Elena had written in her invitation. It's also about the possibility of change and the responsibility we all have to prevent harm to others. Margaret sat in the auditorium as Elena, now tall and confident like her mother, delivered a presentation that was both mature and hopeful. Elena spoke about the harm Margaret had caused her family, but also about the positive work she was doing now. Bad people aren't necessarily irredeemable people, Elena concluded. But redemption requires genuine remorse, consistent action to make amends, and acceptance that some harm can't be undone. After the presentation, Elena approached Margaret. They had never met in person, though they had exchanged a few letters over the years. "Thank you for coming," Elena said. "I know this must be difficult for you." Margaret nodded, too emotional to speak for a moment. Here was the child whose life she had once threatened, now grown into a thoughtful young woman who understood justice in ways that Margaret was still learning. "Thank you for including my story," Margaret finally managed. "And thank you for showing that even someone like me can find a way to contribute something positive to the world." 20 years after Margaret Thornfield's arrest, Willowbrook Estates remained a thriving community where families of all backgrounds lived without fear of harassment or discrimination. The apple tree in the Martinez yard had grown tall and strong, its fruit shared freely with neighbors who stopped by to chat over the fence. Sarah had become a respected advocate for homeowners' rights, serving on state commissions and advising legislators on community governance issues. David had become a high school principal known for his empathy and commitment to justice. Elena was in her second year of law school, planning to follow in her grandfather's footsteps as a prosecutor. Margaret, now in her 70s, continued her work with legal aid organizations. She had never married or had children, but she had found purpose in protecting others from the kind of abuse she had once inflicted. Her health was failing, but her commitment to making amends remained strong. The Homeowner Protection Act had been adopted by 37 states and had prevented countless families from experiencing the kind of harassment the Martinez family had endured. The law stood as a monument to the principle that justice requires not just punishment for wrongdoing, but systematic changes to prevent future harm. When Margaret passed away at age 76, she left behind a complex legacy. The families she had harmed would never forget the pain she had caused. But the families she had helped protect through her advocacy work, hundreds of them, would remember her as someone who had used her knowledge to shield them from abuse. Elena, now a prosecutor like her grandfather, delivered a brief eulogy that captured the complicated truth of Margaret's life. "Margaret Thornfield caused real harm to real people," Elena said to the small gathering. "She abused her power, terrorized families, and nearly cost me my life before I was even born. But she also spent the last 15 years of her life working to ensure that no other families would suffer as mine did." Elena paused, looking out at the assembled mourners, legal aid lawyers, homeowners Margaret had helped, and a few former Willowbrook residents who had found their own form of closure. "Justice isn't just about punishment," Elena continued. "It's about accountability, change, and the ongoing work of building a society where everyone can live with dignity and safety." Margaret's story reminds us that this work is never finished, and that even those who have caused great harm might find ways to contribute to healing. As Elena stood in the backyard of her childhood home, now 30 years old and recently appointed as a federal prosecutor, she was pregnant with her first child. The apple tree her father had planted before her birth now towered over the yard, its branches heavy with fruit. She felt the baby move inside her and thought about the stories that would shape this new generation. Her child would grow up hearing about the grandmother who had almost died because someone decided her family didn't belong in their neighborhood. But they would also hear about the great-grandfather who had fought for justice, the parents who had refused to be intimidated, and even the enemy who had eventually become an unlikely ally in the fight against abuse. The lessons were complex but important: that power corrupts when left unchecked, that ordinary people can become monsters when they dehumanize others, but also that redemption is possible for those willing to do the hard work of genuine change. Most importantly, that justice requires constant vigilance and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. In neighborhoods across the country, families lived safely in their homes because people had been willing to fight for what was right. Young couples planted gardens without fear, children played in yards without worrying about arbitrary rules, and community leaders served rather than terrorized. The apple tree rustled in the evening breeze, its fruit ready for harvest, its roots deep and strong in soil that had once been watered with tears but now nourished hope for generations yet to come. This story reminds us that justice requires both punishment for wrongdoing and the courage to stand up against those who abuse their power. It shows that even in our darkest moments, hope can survive, families can heal, and communities can become stronger when people refuse to be silenced by bullies.